Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. This story begins one very sunny morning. The weather was just lovely in the beautiful palace. However, here were the inhabitants of this palace who were not so cheerful, and especially the little girl who was holding her father's hand. She knew she shouldn't cry, even though she was insanely sad and wanted to burst into tears on the spot. But she forbade herself to do so, for she realized that her father wanted to do something very important for the empire. So he had to go there. She began to quickly wipe her tears from her eyes to prevent him from noticing them, and realized that if she cried, her daddy's footsteps would become heavy and he would be leaving, but very sad. Suddenly they stopped and the man sat down. He turned to Ava and said that he would surely come home with a crazy success. So he smiled and asked her not to rub her eyes, because it would be soon enough and she wouldn't even blink an eye. Eve looked at him and wondered how long they would have to wait this time. She wondered if it would be a year, like last time, or 2 years, like that time. The man smiled sadly and replied that he unfortunately couldn't promise her anything. However, His Majesty would not make any more investments. He explained to his daughter that they simply could not wait any longer while Count Massey squandered the treasury. They need to blame Count Massey for the failed study as soon as possible and break this deal immediately. Then he realized that it all sounded like an excuse, and smiling at his daughter, told her that he would try his best to get back to her as soon as possible. He began to wipe the tears from Eva's eyes, and said that in that case, when he returned, he would have already seen her become the crown princess, and would be incredibly proud of his little girl. He also told her to definitely not worry about her lessons, but to always be careful in her words and actions. He, smiling, said that she should watch everything she would perform, for she was the girl who would soon shine brightest in this empire. Eva kissed her dear father on the forehead, and told him that she wished him the best of luck on his adventure, and would look forward to his return. In fact, she really hoped her father's trip would be a good one. Soon, they put him in the wagon, and the man drove off. A maid soon came up to her and told her that she need not worry, for the Count was the greatest explorer in the empire, and he would soon return safe and sound, with mountains of riches gathered along the way. However, things were not as the maid had said, nor as Eva had hoped. Her father never returned. After 3 years of his absence, Castle Bale and its lands were simply given to another man, and the imperial family announced the breaking of her engagement to the crown prince. And one day the nanny was standing in the princess's room packing her things into her suitcase, and she said in a sad voice that she didn't want to go anywhere. Eva will soon have to leave her hometown and her home estate to embark on a journey unknown to her. Nanny suddenly stopped and told Miss that she must hold on even when she was sad. Then it would be a relief to the Earl in heaven, for he always believed that she could cope with any hardship. Eva sighed heavily and said she would try, but she herself didn't realize how she would be able to stand it when there was no father or nanny around. The woman came close to her and, putting her arm around her, told her to look at her, for right after the hard times, happy days were sure to come back to her, and if she waited a little longer they would meet again. The older woman looked her straight in the eye and told her that she was the noblest lady she had ever seen, and may Eve never forget that, and act with determination. For a while the girl was silent, and then she said that she would surely hold on for their sake, for Nanny's sake, and for her father's. And after that she hugged her tightly, and the woman told her to always be kind and proud, and never forget that she was praying for her well-being. Some more time passed, and all the workers of this estate came out to bid farewell to the precious princess. When they finally did get out, the coachman who was to accompany Eva became indignant and asked Nanny why they were taking so long at all. Did they really think a man like him had much time on his hands? The woman led the girl under her arm and said that they apologized to him and that it would not happen again. But Baron Jules sighed heavily. He said that he hadn't received his paycheck for months, and he was also having this kind of problem, and it annoyed him immensely. The man continued to complain irritably, saying that they had no idea how expensive it was to clothe and feed a person, and if they had any conscience at all, they should have thought about it. But then suddenly, another man came up to him, and he told Baron Jules to stop already, and wondered if he really should have left his dirty word in a situation like this. Baron became immediately uncomfortable and apologized and said it would not happen again. Then a man named Lawrence approached Ava. She immediately ran up to him and said hello. He wished that she would always be protected by the Lord and said that he and she would meet again one day. The girl hugged him at once and told him to take care of himself too, for he must visit her after his journey. Lawrence, smiling, told Madame that he would take care of it. Eve then walked over to Matthew, who was in charge of the beauty around the estate, and hugging him, thanked him for decorating the moonlit garden. Then she went to the Holy Father, who always lived on their estate, and told him to protect everyone. The man replied that he certainly would, and that the Lord would protect her and all those present. Then the Baron spoke again and told her to hurry up and sit down soon, for they had already lost quite a lot of time. Eve was leaving behind all of her former life, and the people she loved and valued incredibly. And before she stepped into the wagon, she took one last look at them all. The girl did not know what lay ahead of her, but she realized that it would be incredibly hard to leave all these people, and not know when she would return again. Eva suddenly saw her nanny's crying face and couldn't stand it. She immediately ran up to her, starting to hug her. She said she would miss her incredibly. The woman hugged her back and said she would miss her too. Then the girl said that she didn't want to leave her. She wanted to be with her nanny, not with this Baron, and asked them to take her with them. Nanny looked at her with tearful eyes and didn't understand how she could even leave this little girl alone when she had spent her whole life with her. Then she took her under her arm and walked over to Baron Jewel, who sat indignantly waiting for them to finish their sentiment. The nanny turned to him and asked him to take her with them. She would work with the maids, and she wouldn't have to pay for it at all. She just wanted to stay close to Eva. The man agreed to such a thing, for he really wouldn't want to pay her, and extra hands he figured wouldn't hurt. And so several hours passed from that moment. It was now completely dark outside, and soon their wagon pulled up beside a small house. They were met there by a little boy and a woman who was very richly dressed. The nanny, as soon as she came in, bowed at once and said hello to Baroness Jewel. But at that moment, a red-haired girl ran out behind them. When she saw Eva, she said that she was incredibly happy that she had finally come to them. She then ran up to her and started hugging her tightly, saying that she was very happy to see her again, and Eva was so surprised that she just mouthed her name. Pamela said in her ear that she was happy because her family was now destroyed. And when Eve heard these words, she was so surprised and distressed that she could not even answer her. And the girl also said that she was incredibly happy that now Eva was not the Count's daughter. They stood and hugged for a while longer, and from that moment Eva's life was ruined. And so the 5 years that the girl lived there finally passed. The nanny, because of her old age and poor living conditions, soon fell ill with a very serious illness. Eva kept asking that she drink these pills that I bought especially for her, and drink as much fluids as possible so that this virus would somehow get out of her. The nanny, coughing, thanked the lady and said that it was only thanks to her that she could be completely healthy tomorrow. Of course, she knew it wasn't true, and Eva knew it was unlikely. Suddenly, the voice of the Baroness was heard from above, asking where Eva was and why she was not coming down. The girl ran quickly down the stairs, and suddenly a torn dress fell at her feet. She immediately looked at it in surprise. The Baroness, for her part, began to scream and asked if she had done it. Her voice was full of disgust. Eva, for her part, started looking at those clothes and said there was a hole in the skirt, and she certainly didn't do it. But the Baroness began to yell at her even harder and told her not to even try to lie to her, for everyone had seen her ironing her clothes in the morning. The woman said she had taken her in. She was eating and living in her house for free, and now she could lie to her face like that. Eva tried to be perfectly calm, for she had grown accustomed to constant scandals, and replied that she had not lied to her, but was telling the truth. The Baroness slapped her on the cheek with all her might because she thought she was at fault. Pamela suddenly ran out to them, and turning to her mother wondered what she was even doing. The woman looked at her daughter and told her to stay out of it because the girl had burned her skirt. The woman looked at her daughter and told her to stay out of it because the girl had burned her skirt. Then she took Eva's hand and went outside and said that she really didn't understand why her mom always clung to her like that, and also apologized to Eva for it. The girl, still holding her hand, said she was all right, and Pamela came closer to her and suggested that she not even think about it or talk about it anymore. She pointed her somewhere to the side, telling her to look over there. Her estate was visible from there, and Pamela said she had heard recently that the new owner of the town had arrived. When Eve saw this, she was very upset, for she noticed that the Earl of Malis's flag had even been taken down already. Pamela said that the new count's name was Cold, and he was from a noble family and very rich. So she suggested that we go there and take a closer look. At this very time, in the woods near the river, the men were lying down and taking a little rest after a hard day's work. Eva and her friend were sitting in the bushes nearby, and Pamela said it was Earl Holland and his friend. She also said with a smile on her face that they were staying at the castle for their summer vacation, and they had ridden around the Vale Manor grounds on horseback in the morning, and were now just relaxing. She also said she didn't know the reason why no one had visited the castle for 5 whole years, but things have definitely changed now. She looked at the man who had black hair and wore a blue uniform, and said that this one was probably Earl Holland. Pamela even blushed, and said that perhaps there would be a ball or a party soon, since the Count was now present in their empire. But then Eve interrupted her, getting up from her seat, and suggested that she should leave, because she still had a few things to do. But she suddenly grabbed her by her dress and said that while she had the chance, she'd like to observe the Count rather than go home already. Eva looked at her in surprise and asked what she even meant, and Pamela said with a completely confident expression that she was going to seduce him. The girl, when she heard this, immediately sat back down and looked at her friend in surprise and asked if it was really true. The girl in turn, smiling, said that she was determined to win the Earl's heart and marry him. She wanted to get out of this horrible crockfield and go to the capital. Pamela, smiling, also said that if she married the Earl, she would become mistress of Vale Castle. Eva said nothing, but only looked at her in surprise. Then the girl said that she did not know just how to attract their attention, and how she should act so that it would not arouse unnecessary suspicion. At that moment, the men, without even undressing, ran into the water and started splashing there. They were having fun and feeling good, because it was very hot outside. Pamela, when she saw it, was ready to scream with all her emotions and told Eve to just look at it, because it was incredible in her opinion. Then Eva noticed one man who had some strange scarring on his body through his shirt. She immediately assumed they were some kind of scars, but she didn't understand how an aristocrat could be so seriously injured. Pamela, in turn smiling, told her friend that she needed her help and wondered if she could push her into the water to get their attention. Eva, when she heard this, was very indignant and said that it was better not to do that, for she could not swim at all and might just drown. But her friend replied that she needn't worry, for they would surely save her before she could even blink an eye. Eve, for her part, still doubted whether the plan would work, and said that she could fall into the water herself. Why should she? But the girl had no time to say a word, and then suddenly Eva was already in the water, and Pamela was looking at her contentedly. She said she couldn't do that because she had a very pretty dress and it would be ruined if it got wet. Eva at this point began to move her arms and legs vigorously and asked for Pamela to help her, for she was really beginning to sink. Then the girl ran towards those men and asked them to help her, because her friend had fallen into the water and was about to drown. But by then Eva was already falling to the bottom of the lake and mentally begging for help. She could do nothing. Her lungs were filling with the river water. At that moment she remembered what Pamela had said a little earlier. She wondered how Eva could even consider herself a countess, for if she had any conscience at all, she should be helping around the house from now on. That's when the realization came to her that it was her after all. She wanted a new dress to buy, so she made a hole in the old one. Eva fell deeper and deeper and realized that it was better to die like this. She did not want to go through these pains and humiliations anymore. She even thought of her dear nurse, who was lying sick in bed and could not even get up. She sacrificed absolutely everything for Eva and was her second mom, and her name was Cecil. Then the girl thought about the fact that when she died, she wanted Nanny to be cured so she could live out that life with a clear mind and conscience. But at that moment, Eva suddenly realized that she could not die like that, and must return to her dear strength. She began to raise her hand up and asked for someone to help her and save her. And at that moment, she suddenly felt someone take her hand. But by then she had already lost consciousness. It was a dark-haired man. He immediately picked up the girl and carried her to the shore, laying her on the ground. Fortunately for Eve, he wasn't too late, and she immediately began coughing and coughing out of her lungs the water she had swallowed. Then the man, standing right above her, asked, "Has she completely lost her mind to throw herself into the water without knowing how to swim?" Eva looked at him in surprise and said nothing. Then his face suddenly softened a little, and he asked if she was all right. When the girl came to her senses and blushed from the awkwardness of the situation, she said she was fine, and it was only because of him. The man moved closer to her, and then stood up and threw his jacket over her shoulders to keep her warm. He said in a very serious voice that it was very good that nothing so serious had happened, and she was just lucky they were there, for otherwise she might even have died. The girl blushed even more and said that it was somehow hard for her to breathe. Her whole heart was beating so hard, and her lungs really couldn't inhale properly. But by then, Pamela suddenly ran up to her and asked if she was all right. The man had already started to get dressed to leave. The girl immediately ran up, hugging Eve, and told her that she had no idea how scared she was, and that it was all because of her. Her request had almost gotten her hurt. The girl replied that she was absolutely fine, so she had better stop crying. Pamela then wiped her tears, turned to the man who had saved the girl and thanked him, saying that Eva had tripped while picking raspberries. The man, when he heard the name, immediately inquired who it was, and Pamela explained that this was the name of her friend, and after that she introduced herself. She said her father was Baron Beatty, and it was a pleasure to meet her. The man smiled, bowed, and said he was glad to meet him. When he wanted to say his name, his friend came up behind him and called him Ruth, asking what he was doing here. After that, the blonde-haired guy just stared at the two girls for a while. Then he stepped forward and said, "Miss, what do I see that you are already all right?" Eva, a little startled, replied that she was indeed fine and they shouldn't worry. The friend then replied that it was all for luck and thought he should introduce himself. He said that he is Earl Benjamin Holland. He then pointed toward the dark-haired fellow and said that this was his friend Sir Ruth, and he was a knight. Pamela, when she saw and heard all this information, was very much surprised, for she was mistaken in saying which of them was the Count. Eve sat looking at the man who had saved her and could not believe that his name was Ruth. She remembered the name from the first time she heard it. Pamela then came forward and said that he had made a strong impression on her, and she had never thought that this man was a mere knight. But she also said, bowing, that it was a great honor for her to meet the two of them. Eve in turn tried to stand up to introduce herself, but realized she still had too little strength. She said she was Abel Turner Macy, but suddenly she felt a sharp pain and grimaced. Ruth immediately came close to her and asked, "Is she in pain?" Then he took her by the leg and inquired, "Is she hurt?" He also asked her to let him see it. Eva in turn got embarrassed and said she shouldn't worry, she was fine, and suggested she just let it go. Ruth in turn smiled and said that he didn't want to force her, but he just needed to examine her leg. He also said that she shouldn't be so embarrassed, because if she didn't get help in time, there could be serious consequences. Eva still let him, and he then removed her sock. He began to feel her foot and asked, "Does it hurt?" The girl felt a very strong pain and said yes. The Count, along with Pamela in turn, stood back and just watched the whole thing. The man continued to rub his leg, and suddenly saw that Eva was crying. He smiled and wondered why she was crying all of a sudden. The girl replied that she was just insanely embarrassed about the whole thing. Then he asked her why she felt that way. The girl said her leg just hurt a lot too and kept crying. Then Ruth replied that he still didn't understand why she felt uncomfortable, because her foot was incredibly beautiful, and there was nothing to be ashamed of about it. This is simple medical care that absolutely everyone should do. For a while they just sat there looking at each other. Then Benjamin intervened and said that he thought the lady had come to her senses, so they should go back. Ruth looked angrily at the gentleman, who in turn turned around and began to pretend as if he was completely oblivious to him, and didn't understand why he was looking at him like that. Pamela then decided to intervene in their conversation and asked if she could invite the two of them to this dinner. She knows it's a bit sudden, but she'd like to thank them for saving her friend, because she doesn't know what she would have done if they hadn't been there. The Duke, bowing, said he was much obliged to her, and Ruth replied that they agreed to the invitation. He smiled and said that a gentleman could not refuse a lady's invitation. Then he turned to the Earl and asked if this was true. Benjamin looked at the girl without looking away and said that all of this was right, so they just had to attend this dinner. Ruth sat down and asked Eve if she could go, but if she was still in pain, he could help her get home. The girl replied that she should not do that, but Pamela intervened in the conversation as usual and said that if it was no trouble to him, they would be most grateful to him. She also added that their house is quite far from this place, and in such a condition, her friend will definitely not be able to stand going for long. Ruth, smiling, looked at the Earl and said that he just might be the one to accompany Pamela, so she wouldn't be so uncomfortable. Benjamin, when he heard all this, realized that he simply had no choice. With a wave of his hand, he said he would do as they said, because who was he to say no to that? Pamela immediately went up to him and said that she was incredibly honored to be accompanied by the Count himself. She also said that he was incredibly kind. Benjamin sighed heavily and thanked her for those words. Then the girl giggled and sat down with the Count on his horse. She turned to Eva and said that she would go now, and that they would see each other later. Eva, of course, made no objection. Soon, however, she was on her feet, and together with Ruth simply watched the Count ride away with the girl on his horse. After they had distanced themselves, the man turned to Eve and said that they should be getting back by now too, and wondered if she even knew how to ride. Eva, looking at him, replied that she could do it a little. Then they walked over to the horse, and the man said she just had to sit as she would. He also added that he would try not to drive too fast. However, if she was scared, let her scream and he would do his best to make the ride fairly calm and peaceful. Eva, smiling, said that she didn't really mind driving fast to get home as soon as possible. Ruth, hearing this, smiled too, and said that in that case he didn't mind either. Then he sat behind her and took hold of the ropes to steer the horse. The girl felt very awkward and didn't know what to do. He was incredibly close to her, and her whole face turned red because of it. Then a man's voice was heard from behind, telling her to hold on tight because they were going to ride with the wind. The girl immediately grabbed the rope, and then he ordered the horse to gallop. They sped away so fast that Eve almost fell over in surprise. However, the man reacted instantly and put his arm around her waist, telling her that everything was fine and she shouldn't worry. Eva glimpsed a glimpse of his focused face, then turned back to the front and began repeating the phrase to herself. The girl thought about the fact that it was as if he was telling her to relax and just enjoy this moment, so she decided to do just that. They galloped through the forest and soon came to a clearing. She was incredibly pleased to feel this sense of freedom. They were flying so fast on the horse that all her hair was developing, and the wind was blowing all over her face. The girl began to feel truly alive and happy. It was as if she was back in the past, and it even made her want to cry. Some time had passed since then, and they stopped outside her house. The girl got off her horse and thanked Ruth for the day. The man, smiling, told Eva that he had been incredibly pleased to meet her. Then she started to take off her jacket, saying she had to return it. But at that moment he suddenly looked closely at her dress, through which her body could be seen, and said that it wasn't dry yet, so she should leave her jacket on and cover herself. Eva stammered, putting her head down, and said that in that case she'd give it back to him as soon as she'd cleaned herself up. The man smiled and said he didn't mind. Then he jumped on his horse and said they would see each other in the evening. He would pick up his jacket. After that, he galloped away, leaving her alone. She couldn't stop thinking about this man, and soon she went home to actually change out of her wet clothes. As soon as Eva ran into her room, she went straight to her nanny, asking how she was feeling. The woman coughed and said that she had asked the girl not to be so impulsive and to behave like a proper lady. Eve then asked if she had studied Latin and French during her illness, as she had been told to learn them. The girl sat down on the edge of the bed and said that she could take it easy, for she was doing very well in her studies. Then she asked the nurse why she had gotten up in the first place, and how she felt. The elderly woman, still coughing, said that she was feeling better now, so she got out of bed. She also asked what the lady had been doing all day. She asked if the Baroness had made her work all day since she hadn't seen her. Eva replied that no, they had just taken a little walk with Pamela that day. Nanny was very surprised to hear this, and asked where they had gone. Eva answered that they had accidentally met the new owner of Vale Castle. She explained that his name was Earl Holland, and a long-standing bond between their families had developed at the castle. When the woman heard this, she was surprised and wondered if Earl Holland had returned, and asked what the Macy flag meant. Eve replied that they had met the Earl of Holland and his friend, who turned out to be a knight, quite handsome. The girl thought for a moment, then turned to her and wondered why she was so excited. Eve replied that they would both come to dinner since Pamela had invited them. Nanny inquired as to the name of this mysterious knight. When the woman heard Eve say his name was Ruth, but she didn't know his last name or if that was his full name, the woman froze and asked again exactly what Eve was talking about. She was very surprised and couldn't believe that the girl was upset because she hadn't remembered the knight's full name. When Eva explained that she was just confused and hadn't heard the full name, Nanny became serious and said that His Highness couldn't be blamed for breaking the engagement, as it wasn't up to him. The nanny advised Eva not to contact him again. Eva was surprised and asked why this conversation had started in the first place. Nanny explained that His Imperial Majesty had arranged the marriage, but after the death of Earl Ebel Macy, the engagement was broken off. Queen took over and decided to break this engagement because she was not the Crown Prince's birth mother. Nanny warned that even though His Highness was not at fault, she had better not mess with him because of the instability and danger of the current imperial family. Eve was surprised and asked how Ruth had ended up in this place. Nanny said that the Earl of Holland's family was related to the late Queen Catherine, and that the son of the Royal Majesty's sister, the Countess of Lotha, plays Holland. Nanny confirmed that Earl Holland's friend's name was Ruth, and it was all true. Thus he introduced himself. Nanny explained that the name Ruth means light, and when the Crown Prince was a baby, Earl Ebel Macy gave him that name. Eve, hearing this, was very much surprised, and then she wondered, is it possible that the sir who brought her to this place is the Crown Prince? The woman, upon reflection, said that this may indeed be true, or perhaps not. However, she thought that the girl should take it all into consideration. After all, if this man is really His Imperial Highness, she had best not fall in love with him. She earnestly asks that Eva hold back her feelings and emotions as long as possible. Eva, when she heard this, was very surprised. However, soon after this conversation, she still had a lot of work to do, which she had to get done in time for dinner. She, along with the rest of the maids, mopped the floors and then wiped down every shelf to ensure that there was not the slightest sign of even dust. Soon, when she was done and she exhaled with relief and thought that it would be nice to get some rest before dinner. So Eva started upstairs very tired and was still thinking about that morning's conversation with Nanny. She still couldn't believe that this man could really be the Crown Prince. After all, His Highness was supposed to be on the border. A celebration would be held on the occasion of his return, and rumors would have spread throughout the empire. Soon Eva opened the door to her bedroom and suddenly saw the Baroness standing in the middle of the room. The woman jumped in surprise, and Eve looked at her in surprise, wondering what she was doing in her room. The Baroness replied that she had been looking for her, for there was no reason for her to be in her room any longer. She also said that she had not been seen all day, which was why she had come to see her in person. Eve was very surprised at that. And then, with a heavy sigh, she said that she'd been working all day in full view of everyone, so she could have seen her for once. Baroness, for her part, coughed and said that in any case she had only come to say that she need not attend this dinner. She explained that only their family members would be attending it, and they wouldn't want an outsider to disturb the guests. So she wants the girl to go back to work after she says hello. Eve, when she heard this, was very surprised. However, of course, she couldn't argue with Mistress, so she replied that she understood everything. And she also said that she did not want to see her disgusted expression. Then she came closer to Eva and asked in disgust, "Does she really think she is a noble lady?" But without saying anything else, she left the room and asked that Eve return to work immediately, for she was not keeping her here for truancy. When the door slammed shut, Eve went to her shelf and started searching everything, hoping nothing was missing. The girl then began to adjust her uniform, thinking about the fact that in the end, yes, she didn't have any jewelry anyway, so there was nothing to steal. But at that moment a boy suddenly approached her from behind, and turning to Eva and calling her cute, asked her what she was doing. When the girl heard this, She immediately turned around and asked him to not do that under any circumstances. The guy in turn smiled evilly and wondered, what on earth is she even talking about? After all, he just got home and wondered why she didn't greet him properly. Eva stepped farther away and told him not to even dare approach her, but he instead came closer to her. The guy kept smiling and told her to stop pretending to be modest, because she was lucky he was at all lenient under the circumstances. Eva's legs were trembling very much. However, she still stepped further and further away and said that he was now allowing himself to be excessive. Therefore, it was better for him to stay away. At that moment, however, Todd grabbed her hand and started pulling her to him, saying that she apparently didn't understand at all. The more the girl resisted, the more he became aroused, and she still could not escape from him, because she was his property. The girl looked at him with tearful eyes and asked him to let her go, and asked what he was doing, and told him not to come any closer. But the man still came closer to her, and told her not to move, or it would only get worse. Eve tried to wrench her arm out of his grasp to run farther away, but she couldn't succeed. And at that moment, Pamela came into their room, turning to the guy and asking what he was even doing. She was furious. Then she went up to him, and pushing him, asked him if she had not told him that the Earl of Holland was coming to dinner with them that day, and told him to go away as soon as possible and not to dishonor their family. She also said it was an incredibly important event, and he was sure to ruin it, as always, so he should leave and not come back until the night before. Todd, in turn, started yelling at the girl and said that she was just insignificant. He also wondered how dare she even talk like that. He, smiling, also told her to wait, because when he gets rich, he will not even look at this pathetic and shabby house. Pamela asked him to shut up and leave already. When she became a countess, she would bring glory and prosperity to their family, and he would be nothing. He told her not to make him laugh, because she was never going to be a countess, and she just shouldn't embarrass herself by even trying to make it somehow. Todd, as he left, said that if Eva dared to seduce the Earl or other men, he would bind her by force and simply throw her into the lake. When he was out the door, the girl wondered what the crazy man was even talking about. Then she suggested that Eve go to her room and help her get ready for dinner. She waved her hand and told the girl to hurry up. Eva was still stunned by what had happened and sat down on the bed trying to calm down. The girl thought about the fact that nothing terrible had happened. She just needed to be patient a lot, and everything would be fine. However, the tears suddenly flowed, and she could not hold back her emotions. Soon she did go to Pamela's room and helped her put on her dress. The girl yelled for Eve to pull harder, tightening the corset. She also explained that the corset would make her waist look slimmer, so you have to tie it as tightly as possible. Eva continued to procrastinate, and Pamela said that the Count ended up being very attractive. She was worried at first when she saw his indifferent expression, but then he smiled at her and said he was looking forward to the dinner. He also said that something curious was going to happen this evening. Then she turned to Eva and asked her what she thought at all about the young man with whom she had stayed afterward. The girl immediately wondered who she was even talking about, pretending to understand absolutely nothing. Pamela replied that she meant Sir Ruth. She thought they got on well together and wondered, being alone, what she thought of him in general. Eve sighed heavily and even blushed a little, remembering what had happened that afternoon. And then she said that she thought he was a nice man, but at that moment she still had in her mind the words of her nanny, who had warned her not to do that. Pamela, for her part, smiled and wondered if she didn't find the man attractive, for she found the exact opposite to be true. Eva, before she could even answer, was silent, and Pamela, interrupting her, said that she couldn't make up her mind, so she needed both of these men. When the girl heard this, she looked at her friend in surprise and wondered what it even meant. Pamela, smiling, replied that she wanted to seduce Sir Ruth as well, besides. And after she marries the Earl, Todd will become her lover, and then she will have everything she wanted. Eva, when she heard this, was very surprised, but of course she couldn't tell the girl anything, and she didn't understand why she had any plans at all. Then Pamela spoke a little more softly and said that as soon as dinner was over, she would be alone with the Earl, and she had better accompany Sir Ruth in the meantime. She explained that she would give the girl a signal from behind, and she would sneak Ruth into her room. Eve suddenly clutched her dress and wondered what she intended to do in this way. The girl smiled smugly and wondered how she was even thinking. Of course she wants to seduce him. And so from that moment on, several more hours passed. Everything on the estate was ready, and the men had finally arrived for the long-awaited dinner. As soon as they entered and were immediately greeted by the maids and the Baron and Baroness, the man greeted Earl Holland and Sir Ruth. He also bowed and said that they were incredibly honored to finally meet them in person and were very happy that the men took the time to attend their dinner. Benjamin spoke up and bowing said that he too was pleased to meet the Baron. Then the Baron pointed to the side and said that this was his wife named Laura and his daughter Pamela, whom they both already knew. He also wanted to introduce his son. She said that unfortunately he was absent that day because he had too many things to do that needed to be done urgently. Laura approached the Earl and extending her hand forward, said she was very pleased to meet him. The man ignored the gesture and said that he too was pleased to meet the Baroness and Miss Beatty. Laura pretended not to notice this, and an awkward silence suddenly formed between them all. Eve, for her part, was dressed quite nicely, but she stood behind the others, as her mistress had told her. But Ruth noticed her and smiled at her. Their gazes met, and it made her feel even more awkward, even hurt. To break the awkward silence, the Baron spoke up and said that they were already allowed to pass. Even though it wasn't a gourmet meal, they still did their best. He also said that the men could make themselves at home. They were about to go forward, but then suddenly Ruth, apologizing, said that there was another person they had not introduced. The Baron smiled nervously and wondered who he was even talking about, for he really didn't understand. Then the man walked up to Eve and said, "This is the lady." He forgot to introduce her. They continued to look each other straight in the eyes. Eva, for her part, was very worried and did not understand who this man was, and most importantly, why he was doing all this in the first place. For a while longer they stood in silence. Then the Baron ran up to Eva and said that he had almost forgotten to introduce her. He called her name and told her to come up and greet the guests. The girl bowed at once. "Greetings, Count and Sir Ruth." She introduced herself by her full name, as befitted a lady. Ruth in turn smiled and said he was very glad to meet her, and asked if he could ask if she knew Earl Mesmerizing of Vale. The girl replied that of course she knew him, for she was his daughter. Then Ruth took her hand, and sitting down on one knee, said that he had not known she would turn out to be the daughter of the much-honored Earl. He kissed her as a sign of respect, and said he was honored to meet her in person. But Pamela, when she saw this, was very angry, for she was going to seduce him too, but now she realized that it would be rather difficult to do so. Eve just stood there looking at him. Then she followed the man's gaze down to the bruise that Todd had caused, so the girl quickly removed her hand. Then the boy got up from his knees and said that apparently there was a real monster living in this house. Everyone was very surprised to hear this. The Baron decided to change the topic of conversation by telling the guests that dinner was already served, and suggested that they talk at the table. Soon they were all seated, and even Eva sat at the table, though the Baroness had told her to go away. Barana approached the Earl and inquired about his views on converting Vale Forest into a hunting area. He felt that it would no doubt serve the economic growth of the Karlax area. Then the Baroness entered the conversation and said that it would be a good idea to have a ball, because since Vale had become a ghost town, the center of the local aristocracy had completely disappeared. Pamela spoke up, saying that the previous Earl didn't really care about the changes in society and didn't put himself in the shoes of the knowers, and so he didn't know what they were demanding. The Count in turn said that it was really his fault, and he would try to revive this town soon, so that everyone would hear about it and be proud to live here. Eve felt very uncomfortable at this point. She didn't understand why on earth she had to sit there and listen to them talk horribly about her father and his rule. And she thought of Ruth's fault, for he was the reason she had stayed at the dinner, when she could have been doing her job. Baran said that as far as he knew, the Earl had not only bought the town of Vale, however, but also the surrounding territory. The man replied that this was correct. Then he asked Benjamin if he would consider putting the Vale lands under his management. After all, he had managed the Earl of Mazersbert's lands before, and there hadn't been the slightest mistake in all that time, so he would surely manage it. Benjamin hesitated, then said he wanted to think about it a little later. The man was immediately pleased and thanked him, even for just considering it. Baroness also rejoiced and said that they were incredibly grateful to the Count for this opportunity. But Benjamin, for his part, waved his hand and said that they shouldn't be so happy, for he hadn't decided anything yet and could refuse. Then the man looked at his partner and saw that he was absolutely calm, and this surprised him, because usually he was against such events and deals. Then the Baroness turned to the maids and asked that they bring more wine. Eve, when she looked at her hand, which she waved, and then saw the huge bracelet with the most beautiful stone, recognized it at once. The girl couldn't believe it. Then she took a glass of wine to drink and try to calm down, because she could not understand the hype like this. But Ruth, who had been watching the girl the whole time, suddenly noticed the change of mood on her face and became alert. And Baroness, for her part, turned to the Earl and thanked him for escorting Pamela home and apologized for the trouble they had caused him. The man replied that she need not thank him. After all, it was an honor to help a beautiful lady like Pamela. The woman immediately laughed and said he was very kind. And smiling, she said that as far as she knew, the Count was unmarried and asked if he had any bride in mind. The man, smiling calmly, replied that not yet. However, he and his mother were looking for suitable candidates for the role. The Baroness immediately looked at her daughter and said that marriages of convenience were popular among aristocrats. And no matter what anyone said, however, marriage should still be based on love. She also, with a sigh, said that love is incredibly beautiful, which started absolutely from a chance meeting because it is remembered forever. Benjamin smiled and said that he agreed. And if he was lucky enough to run into someone like that one day, he would hold on to that person tightly. The girls, when they heard these words, were very surprised, but tried not to show it. Then the Baroness turned to Sulphur Ruth and inquired if he had any bride or chosen one. The man put the utensils on his plate and, looking her straight in the eye, replied that he had no such thing. He had been engaged once a long time ago, but the engagement was suddenly broken off. The woman made a sincere surprise and inquired why this had suddenly happened. The man explained that this insidious decision was made by his parents, and he could not influence it, unfortunately. The woman said that she understood everything. However, she added that he should not blame his family so much, for she was sure that there were reasons for it. Ruth looked at Eva and said that perhaps it was not an easy secret. That's why he feels constant guilt. When the girl heard those words, she immediately raised her head and looked at him. The Baroness in turn remarked and said that apparently he really liked the lady very much, but the man replied that he did not think so. He explained that they had only met once when they were very young, and had never seen each other again since then. Then the woman laughed and said that apparently he wasn't particularly worried. He could easily find another suitable man. She thought he was quite popular with the ladies. The man, smiling, said he hadn't had another woman yet, at which point he began to drink his own. The Baroness was genuinely surprised when she heard this. Then she inquired why it was so. The man replied that a gentleman would not look for other women when he had a fiancée. All this time he looked at Eva and said that, even though he didn't like her, and didn't even remember her after meeting her, he still thought she was the only one he could marry. Soon, dinner came to an end. They did not broach the subject of love again, but talked about some ordinary matters. When evening came, Eva went up to the Baroness's room and, approaching her from the back, asked that she return her now bracelet to her. The woman immediately turned around and made a surprised look, asking which bracelet was even in question. Then she raised her hand and pointed to the bracelet, asking if she really meant it. Then she explained that she was just borrowing it for a while. Eva was very serious and angry. She said that taking something without the owner's consent was not a favor, but a real theft. The Baroness suddenly frowned and said that she should speak to her properly, and wondered who gave her the right to treat her so disrespectfully. Eve didn't bother with her for very long. She held her hand out in front of her and asked that the woman give it back to her immediately. The girl, in turn, fixing her hair, replied that she was sorry, but that she could not return it. Eve wondered why that was so. The Baroness replied that it was because her family had gone bankrupt and they had not received their wages. They had taken her in because of the old friendship between their families, and asked her if she knew how much it cost to support her and Cecil. She ran her hand over the bracelet and said she could look at it as if she was just paying back a debt she owed their family. Eva in turn raised her voice and said that if she took it from her, she would have to report the very real theft. The Baroness grinned and said that in that case she could go ahead and do it. However, she wondered who would really believe her words. Ava replied that gems are subject to inspection, where they were produced and who worked on them, by what route they came into the hands of their owners. All this is always recorded and memorized. When the Baroness heard this, she was very much surprised and asked what it was that she was even saying, for indeed she had never heard of it before. Eva explained that the investigation would reveal that the owner of the bracelet was her mom. Then the theft of her bracelet would become public knowledge, and everyone would be very interested to hear how it happened. And most importantly, why on earth the Baroness stole it. The woman suddenly became very angry and came closer to the girl. She swung around and asked, "Is she really crazy to threaten her like that?" But I intercepted her hand, which she was about to hit her with, and told her that she was now taller and stronger than her. And I asked, "Does she really think she's going to take it? All because she can't stand up for herself?" The Baroness suddenly became worried and asked that the girl let go of her hand right now. Eva in turn continued and asked, "Has she forgotten that despite the fall of her family, she is still the daughter of Count Berbert? She thinks that the Baroness should be well aware of how serious an act it is to insult an aristocrat. And it doesn't only apply to commoners. Even punishment would follow for insulting an aristocrat whose title is higher." The woman was starting to get very worried, and asked in a trembling voice how she could even dare to say such a thing. At that moment, Eve finally let go of her hand. The Baroness immediately took a few steps away from her, and the girl warned her that if she ever tried to even hit her again, she wouldn't just let it go, and holding out her hand, asked that she return the bracelet to her right now. The woman immediately took off the bracelet and threw it on the floor, saying she didn't even need the junk. She just took it to spite her. Eva immediately picked up the bracelet and was ready to cry. However, she was still standing at the Baroness's side, so she just walked away. As soon as the girl returned to her room, she felt just awful. She couldn't believe what she had just done. However, Ava was not proud that she could finally stand up for herself. She realized that she would be punished for it. She sat down on the floor and closed her eyes, thinking that she had done the right thing. If she didn't want to be humiliated, she had to be stronger and show that she had the right to stand up for herself. When evening came, the girl changed her clothes and came to her nanny, asking if she was feeling better already. Cecil lay on her bed all day and said she shouldn't worry so much. She was feeling much better that day, but of course that was all a lie. Then the nurse asked Eve if the Griffond and Sir Ruth had already left. She replied that she need not worry, for they would be gone very soon. Nanny took her hand and told her that she must be very tired that day, so she had better go back to her room and rest properly. The girl smiled and said that she had better go to bed and not think about anything. Then she put out the candle and took the dirty plates and started downstairs. At that moment, Pamela suddenly ran toward her, asking where she was even being carried. Eve replied that she had gone to the babysitter's house to check on her and wondered what had even happened. The girl said that the Earl and Sir Ruth are in the courtyard now. She has sent Rosie after them. One cat has not yet returned, so she wants Eve to come up and find out what is even going on there. The girl looked at her in surprise and asked why she had to do it at all. Pamela wondered irritably if she couldn't remember what they had talked about. She must find a way to get Earl Holland to her room and then try to apprehend Ruth. But Ava turned around and started to walk away, saying that she wasn't going to do that. It was her plan, so it was up to her to carry it out. When the girl heard this, was very surprised, and asked if they had not agreed that they would do this together, and wondered why she had suddenly changed her mind so drastically. Ava, without even turning to look at her, replied that she thought she had agreed to it. But in fact the girl had agreed to nothing at all. Eve realized for herself that she wanted nothing more to do with this horrible family that only liked to set things up. Pamela suddenly stepped forward and said that she could take care of taking Cecil to the hospital. She would talk to her father tomorrow about getting her sent to a very good hospital where they could take care of her. Eva gritted her teeth when she heard this. She had to choose between her pride and the health of her dear nurse. At that time, the Duke was standing in the courtyard with his friend, and they were talking about something. The boy told His Highness that it was time for them to go back, for it was getting rather late. And Benjamin in turn replied that if they lingered here, it could be quite dangerous. He said that the imperial family was probably already aware that he had left the front. Rod was very surprised and asked what that meant, since he was on a legal vacation, so he was just resting. Benjamin suddenly frowned and turned to His Highness and asked if he thought he was being rather odd in general since they had met those ladies. Ruth smiled lightly and wondered what he thought was wrong with him in the first place. The man in turn asked why he was suddenly displaying the Bird family flag. Didn't he realize that it might attract unwanted attention? Ruth in turn replied that he felt guilty. Her hands are very rough, so he thinks he should watch her more closely. At that moment, the maid Eve, who was on her way there to play along, suddenly ran out of the woods, saw Rosie, and was very surprised. She turned to her and asked, "What happened?" The girl was so frightened that she said in a trembling voice that Sir Ruth was not really a knight. Ava looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant, and asked that the girl explain it normally. Rosie was so frightened that she couldn't even say anything. Then she turned away from the girl, and as she started to walk away, she said it didn't matter. She'd just come back. She immediately ran towards the manor, and His Highness was very surprised and didn't understand what was even happening to her. Benjamin in turn continued to communicate with His Highness and said that his lives were in danger, but he shouldn't worry about the tea party, but return as soon as possible. And at that moment they suddenly heard a loud sound behind them, and the men immediately ran. Benjamin saw Eva, who, seeing him, began to scream loudly. Benjamin asked what she was even doing here, and also wondered how much she had heard from their conversation. Ava said in a trembling voice that she was just passing by, and before she could add more, she heard behind her the voice of Ruth, who, seeing her, was very much surprised. She said she had come to tell them that the tea was ready, and she had heard nothing more from their conversation. She swears on everything she has that she didn't mean to overhear anything and didn't understand what the conversation was about. Ruth smiled and bowed, and said that this is indeed true. Apparently the game of Holland today is a little sensitive, so that is why he reacted like this, however, he believes. Benjamin didn't answer anything but only looked at the man in surprise, not understanding what he was even doing. Ruth then replied that they had had a rather important conversation, so he was a little nervous and reacted that way. And he also said that he was deeply sorry that she had been blamed for such a terrible incident. Eve was a little surprised at this, and then said that there was nothing wrong with it. Ruth in turn replied that in that case they could all go back. Then they went out through the woods and were beginning to approach the manor. The girl did not know what to do now, or how she should apprehend Sir Ruth as Pamela had asked her to do. The guy was walking next to her and, seeing her worried expression, turned to her. The girl heard his voice in complete silence and jumped with surprise and asked him what he wanted. Ruth smiled and said it was just an amazing night, and also asked if she would suddenly like to go for a walk with him. When Benjamin heard this, he was very indignant and was about to say that it was wrong to do so, but the man replied to tell the Count to go back inside and have some tea. They looked at each other for a while, saying nothing. But then Benjamin sighed heavily and said that he hoped they'd both be back as soon as possible. After that he went to the manor, and Ruth asked the girl if they could go already. Eva agreed, and they went somewhere in the direction of the garden. The man walked in silence for a while, and then asked if he could ask her a question. The girl replied in a quiet voice that of course he could ask anything he wanted, but she didn't really know how much more of this walk she would even have to endure. Ruth glanced at her and wondered how she had ever found herself in Baron Beatty's house. Eva put her head down and said that it had happened by accident, and she said nothing more. Then the man smiled and said that if she needed help, she could come to him at any time. She looked at him in surprise, and then thought about the fact that he realized what her position in this house was. She didn't want his pity, though, so she thanked him for his kindness and concern, and told him she was fine and didn't need any help. Ruth suddenly saw the sad expression on her face, and apologized for broaching such a sore subject, and if he had offended her. Eva didn't look him in the eye and said that it's nothing like that. She knows he's a good man, so he doesn't need to apologize at all. She also knows that he said it because he's just worried about her. Then he suddenly stopped and looked her straight in the eye and told her that he wasn't as good as she thought he was. He also added that he trusts absolutely no one. It is not easy for him to be considerate of other people. Ruth was silent for a while. Then he said that he was very cruel, and if someone gave him away or hurt someone close to him, he would have no mercy at all. That's why he thinks he can help her with absolutely any difficulties apart from finances. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised and asked if it was true. The knight replied that he could protect her. If someone suddenly hurt her, he would definitely deal with them. And at this moment, he looked at the bruise she had on her arm. She immediately backed him up and told him that it was absolutely not worth it, because he didn't have to. She was silent for a while, and then she said that Todd wasn't really a bad person. He was just a little rough, that's all. Because she also said that she would be leaving pretty soon, so he definitely didn't need to worry about her. The man smiled at this point and said that since she said so, he would believe it. After that, he turned to the side and offered to go on his way. Ava exhaled with relief and followed right behind him. Then she wondered if she could ask him a question now. Ruth smiled and said that of course she could ask. Then she wondered why he had suddenly decided to help her like that. He pondered the answer for a while, and then said that perhaps it was because he had been in a rather similar situation himself. Then he asked if she was visiting the Vale. The girl said no, and he asked in surprise if she was homesick. Eva didn't even make eye contact with him until then, and said that she certainly misses him sometimes. Smiling, she also added that in the evening, if he had time, she wanted him to visit the moon garden on the west side of the castle. When the man heard this, he was very surprised and asked which moon garden we were talking about, for he really hadn't heard of it before. And she explained that it's such a small courtyard with a fountain, which is also incredibly beautiful during the day, but becomes even more beautiful in the evening when the moon rises. Ruth hesitated when he heard this, and then suddenly stepped aside, asking her to wait for him briefly at this spot. He would be back soon. The girl was a little surprised and didn't understand what was wrong, even assuming that she had said something wrong, since he wanted to leave so quickly. After standing for a while longer, she suggested that perhaps she should head back already. At the same time, however, she heard some strange sounds coming from far out in the woods, and soon she saw a man on horseback approaching her. Soon he stopped beside her and holding out his hand offered her a seat. "Vid, they're going to Vale right now." And smiling, he inquired if she had said that one could only enjoy the beauty of the garden in the evening. Eva continued to stand still. She didn't know if she could even go right now. No doubt she missed this place very much, but she had never dared to come even close to it in so many years. Soon she did put her hand in his, and thought about the fact that even in her dreams, she sees him very far away, and every time she wakes up, she feels incredibly regretful. The man sat her down behind him and told her that it was quite chilly at night, so she'd better snuggle up to him so she wouldn't catch cold. After that, he galloped off. They rode quite fast, and indeed the wind was blowing the girl hard, so she huddled against Ruth, hiding behind his huge back. Some time had passed since then, and they had already begun to drive up to the estate. And at this very time at her home was washing and making near her mother, and the woman said that the mountain at Holland completely fascinated her. The girl, without showing much interest, said that this, of course, went without saying. But then suddenly she became thoughtful, and Mother, when she saw her worried face, immediately inquired what was the matter. Pamela sighed heavily and said it was no big deal. Then Mother smiled, pleased, and said that she would do well. They had very high hopes for her, and wanted her not to let them down. The girl said she knew all that, but first she needed to take care of her no-good son. It's an incredible shame. Mother sighed heavily and wondered why she had suddenly allowed Ava and Sir Ruth to be alone together in the first place. What if an affair were to break out between them, even? But Pamela said with complete confidence in her voice that this would definitely not happen, because she knows her place. However, Mother told her not to forget, for Eve would do anything for her own safety, and she might even want to get out of this situation by winning Ruth's heart. In fact, she even had the feeling that he liked Eve. Pamela objected and said it was just pity. He saw that his daughter, who had never been a noble of the family, was now forced to live and eat on an equal footing with the maids. So he took pity on her, and then suddenly she wondered why she should entrust the care of Eva to a girl as wonderful as she was. She's inferior in every way.